Well, let's talk trees, shrubs, and lawns. Now, I thought it'd be fun to kind of take a walk around our yards and kind of talk about everything that's going on, different things that we can be doing this time of year, and just take a look. And please do, let us know any questions. And Doreen, do feel free to interrupt me if there's a question about a particular segment that we're talking about, or we can address things towards the end.
Sounds good.
That's a wonderful time of year too, as things start to develop outdoors. So we're going to take a little bit of a walk past each of these segments in a person's yard. Now, these aren't necessarily my yard, but anyway, let's start in the perennial garden. And it's fun to leave the tops on perennials in the fall of the year and through winter because they actually look quite nice, don't they? Poking up out of the snow, it gives something to look at. And also the tops of perennials, the hollow stems, are a good habitat for pollinators, little native bees that help us have good supplies of cucumbers and apples and everything else. Those little native pollinators are often wintering inside the hollow stems of perennials. And so then leaving those on all winter gives pollinator habitat. And then in springtime, we can cut that back. Now, it's recommended when you do cut the tops of perennial flowers back that you don't automatically dispose of that because there might be little pollinators in those. So instead, just stack the material kind of to the rear of your perennial flower bed or beside the garage somewhere until well into May, towards the end of May. And any pollinators then that are hibernating in there will have time to exit. At a certain point, though, you do need to get the tops off of the perennials. For example, there in the left-hand side, when the little perennials start to grow from the base, the old top should be cut off because once the new growth starts getting too tall, then it intermingles with the old dead stuff and it's just harder to remove it. Now, the ornamental grasses, there's different good ways to cut that back, and the old top should be cut back before the new starts. And of course, that is one of the first operations in the spring for cleaning up a flower bed, because sometimes those ornamental grasses will start growing fairly quickly. So a person can, with a hedge shears or a sharp serrated knife, or even the hedge type shears seen there, you can just cut them all the way back, get rid of the old dead material, and let the new grass grow. So in the perennial flower bed, fertilizing is important. That will help build a better blossom for the summertime. One of the fertilizers that I like is just the all-purpose 10-10-10. That's called a well-balanced fertilizer that has some of the three main nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, that plants need to grow in largest quantities. And now for like perennial flowers, it doesn't have to be a specific flower type fertilizer, this all-purpose type. It works well. And the one reason I like that fertilizer is it's available almost everywhere. It's at chain stores, it's at the locally owned garden centers, and it's just an easy to obtain product. The label will tell how much of that product to put on. For example, what portion of a cup to apply around each perennial. Spring is a great time to dig and divide or move any perennials that you want to move. And now some types of perennial flowers should wait until fall. If it's a perennial that blooms in the early part of the summer, such as peonies or bleeding heart, those should wait until September. A good way to remember that is that a perennial is most sensitive when it's going to be blooming. And so since peonies are going to be blooming in another month or so, maybe, we should delay digging, dividing those. So peonies, bleeding hearts, we wait until September. Many of the other perennials, though, such as the hosta here, can be dug and divided, multiplied in the spring of the year. I like to wait until a little bit of growth is starting to appear so that you know you're getting a good live clump. For example, if a neighbor wants some of your hosta, just wait a little bit until something is appearing to make sure you're not giving your neighbor just a dead chunk. And so many things can be moved. And how do you know if a perennial needs dividing? How do you know if that would help its health? A couple of ways to tell. If the perennial no longer blooms the way it once did, for example, iris, oftentimes they'll just get a dead center and they just don't bloom. So when that happens, if the center is dead and all the good stuff is around the outer perimeter, then dividing and relocating a nice healthy clump from the exterior part, that will help the perennial, in this case iris, to get growing better again. So definite reasons for digging and dividing or moving.
I have one quick question, Don, while you're
Yes.
on the perennials and the dividing of lilies. What would you do with a lily? Do you like a daylily? They get so big, and is now a good time to do those?
Yes. And now you bring up lily and daylily. Uh, there's a difference, of course. The daylilies are, even though they share a similar name, daylilies have leaves that all arise from a central crown down at ground level. They have all their leaves kind of coming out from that central crown. And the true lilies, if you think like Easter lily type, many of our true lilies, there are nice types, Asiatic types, trumpet lilies, those have leaves that come out of a long stalk. Okay, so daylilies are so flexible and grow so freely, they can be divided either in spring or fall. September is usually the main time. And the true lilies, that have the big trumpet-shaped blossoms and leaves that come out along the stems, those are best done in September as well. So daylilies and lilies probably delay until September is a good month for those. Let's talk about roses a little bit. And of course, roses, some beautiful types like the peace rose do need winter protection because they just lack the basic winter hardiness. But there is a whole group of Canadian shrub roses, varieties developed in Canada in their breeding program, and many of those have increased hardiness, winter hardiness. And now, not all of the roses that are offered at like some of the chain stores are hardy, even though the tag might say winter hardy. For example, in the upper right, the Easy Elegance series is one you frequently see, but they're not as hardy as others. My favorites are in the center there, the Canadian shrub roses. Now, there are many different types in a rainbow of colors. If you check at especially the locally owned independent garden centers, will likely have a nice selection of these Canadian shrub roses. Lots of different names. There's the Morden series, Hope for Humanity, Campfire is a beautiful one. So do be on the lookout for Canadian shrub roses at our garden centers. They're beautiful roses, and they have a little increased winter hardiness. Now, in the spring of the year, no matter what type of rose that you have, oftentimes you'll see some situations like this. First of all, of course, in early April, we'd take away any covering that we had, but roses will frequently suffer some cane dieback. And you can see in the center picture there, fairly severe injury. The good live portion of the rose is a nice fresh green. What is brown or black, that is killed. And so that material needs to be pruned away. So hopefully your rose, the majority of it, will look more like what is on the kind of left cane there, where it's nice and fresh green. Now, I might mention too that roses love pruning. So even if they do have some cane injury or cane dieback, that's okay. As long as they still have some green down below, just cut back to that green level and let it regrow. Roses actually bloom better on fresh, vigorous new growth. So good heavy pruning. You can see a diagram there where they've really thinned out, shortened back by about half at least, and then kind of thin out the tangle of thin, weak growth and let fresh growth grow, and the rose will bloom. So again, the good old saying that I love, prune until it hurts and then prune some more for most of our materials like roses. And fertilizing. It doesn't have to be a rose type fertilizer. It can, but that 10-10-10 fertilizer is wonderful. And also mulching around roses. Roses love to have their soil cool and moist during the heat of the summer. So a nice wood product mulch, such as shredded bark or shredded wood, put over the soil helps prevent weeds, and it helps keep the soil nice and moist and cool. For winter time, for a little added protection, you can just kind of rake some of that wood mulch up around the base and around the canes, and that will provide some good extra protection. And then in the springtime, just kind of rake the mulch back in place. Let's talk about shrubs a little bit. Now, pictured here is the Annabelle hydrangea, which is a beautiful hydrangea with big round white flowers, and there's a couple other varieties of the same type. They're an interesting shrub because each year they freeze back nearly to ground level, but then they grow back and pop back and bloom beautifully. So the custom is to cut the Annabelle hydrangeas back to about 6 inches above ground level in early spring here before you see much growth growing, or when you just see a little bit of growth. Cut them all the way back 6 inches above ground and then let them regrow. Beautiful, beautiful plants. There's one also called Invincible Spirit. There's a pink one also. So that is one category of hydrangeas. It's well adapted. The big round white Annabelle types. The second type of hydrangea that is well adapted for North Dakota, it's called the paniculata hydrangea types. There are different named varieties. A very popular one is the one called vanilla strawberry, as shown here. And these types of hydrangeas have pyramidal or cone-shaped flower clusters. They perform more like what I call normal shrubs. They don't die all the way back to ground level. Instead, they leaf out from the above ground portions like a normal shrub. And in the spring of the year, the old blossoms can be trimmed back, and you can do some shaping and pruning. You can even prune it back by a good third or so if you would like. And that keeps that type of hydrangea doing well. Now, I didn't include a photo because I just thought of it now. And it's fun to talk about the endless summer hydrangeas. Those are very visible in garden centers because they're sold in bright blue pots, and they are a series like Endless Summer. That's the original one with the blue flowers, and there's one called Twist and Shout, and a couple of others as well in a series. That Endless Summer series is a less adapted. It's more like the florist type hydrangeas, and they struggle greatly in our area. Sometimes they'll do well for the first season, but excuse me. So the endless summer hydrangeas just aren't as well adapted as the other ones that I've mentioned here. I did a little survey a few years ago because these were so commonly sold. I did a little survey of endless summer to see, did people have success? And 99% of those that responded said no. They did okay for the first summer, but they just didn't bloom after that. And so again, they just aren't well adapted for our area. Maybe some of you have had good success with the endless summer. And if you've got kind of a sheltered spot, but again, endless summer in their blue pots, a person might need to use some caution when buying those. So other types of shrubs, the spring is a good time to rejuvenate shrubs. It's preferred to do it before they start to leaf out. If they started to leaf out a little bit, that's fine. Now, dogwoods, such as over on the left-hand side, dogwoods can get so overgrown and woody, and instead of having nice red twigs, sometimes it'll just be grayish bark, and they rejuvenate beautifully by taking all the way back to about 6 inches above ground level and letting them regrow. Best time again is early spring, before they leaf out. And it's better to, go all the way back rather than kind of be timid and go only halfway back, because a total cutback like this rejuvenates. Now, you can't do that with evergreen shrubs. Evergreen shrubs just cannot grow back from that type of cutback. With evergreens, which are best pruned in May and June, evergreen shrubs, you need to trim only in the area where that still has nice green growth. For example, an arborvitae. Um, if you want to kind of, because it's gotten too big, if you want to kind of try to prune it back, you have to keep your pruning cuts in areas that still have the foliage. If you go back into bare wood, evergreens will not generally produce growth on bare wood. So evergreens are a little trickier to try to maintain size. Other shrubs that rejuvenate beautifully are the yellow-flowered potentilla. Every few years, you can cut those all the way back, let it regrow, and then it'll become nice again. And the spireas with the kind of the pinkish flowers, and ninebark, the lower right-hand side, the purple leaf summer wine type ninebarks, they get a lot of dead wood in, and a good rejuvenation early spring lets them produce nice, vigorous growth again. And in most cases, an established shrub will bounce back nicely the same season. They have a lot of push power and a lot of energy down in that root. So when you do the rejuvenation, that energy pushes forth the new growth. So it's not like you have to wait a long time for these shrubs to come back in. So how often should some of these shrubs be rejuvenated? It's, whenever they're not looking so good. Many shrubs, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years in between rejuvenations is fine. So maybe the shrubs don't need a total rejuvenation. Maybe they just need a little bit of trimming to maintain the size. So we don't always need to cut all the way back. But when we do trimming to maintain the height, it's better to selectively cut branches back, cut each branch back a little bit randomly to preserve a natural appearance. If we use shearing, head shears or the motorized type shear, if we continually do that, shrubs develop a very unnatural shape. It also causes such a twigginess in those shrubs, which actually is not that good for the health of the shrub. They tend to get quite leggy and spindly. So unless you have a very formal hedge that you want to shear, in most cases, the selective cut, selectively pruning back is better. Yeah, again, unless you have a formal hedge that you need to shear, or of course, unless you live in Disney World or Disneyland and are shaping things. Okay, let's talk a little bit about trees next. If our trees need some pruning, such as a common type of pruning is if some of the lower branches on a younger tree, if some of the lower branches are knocking you in the face when you're mowing, well, first of all, it's better to leave those branches on the tree as long as you can in a young tree, because those branches tend to feed the tree, feed the trunk, and you'll get a larger tree faster if you leave those lower branches on. But at a certain point, if they're getting in the way of mowing, before they get about an inch in diameter, it's easier to remove those branches at that point. So the best time, of course, is usually before they leaf out in the spring or just as they're starting. I should mention, let me back up a little bit. Now, when a person's removing these kind of main branches back to the trunk, it's important not to leave stubs. So if you're removing these, here we see a lopper, it's also important not to cut too close to the main trunk. When a person is looking at the juncture between a branch and the main trunk, there's a little ridge at that juncture, and cut just outside of that little ridge. That helps the tree to close up that wound better. So don't leave a stub, but also don't cut too flush either. Leave the little ridge of tissue intact. The tree guards that we put around trees, especially important when trees are young, because that can protect the bark during the winter time from different winter type injuries, and can prevent rabbits from gnawing away at the tree trunks. Very important on fruit trees. Fruit trees are very susceptible to sun scald. That smooth bark on a fruit tree will absorb sunlight in the winter time, and oftentimes in spring then we see these blackened portions on the south and southwest. So anyway, tree wraps do a good job on fruit trees as well, but they should be removed each spring so that the trunk and its bark can have access to the sunlight and fresh air. Otherwise, mold and mildew and diseases and insects can all be harbored inside. So off in the spring and then on again in late October. So for a young tree, how many years should you keep putting tree wrap on? Really, until it no longer fits, is quite important. Let's talk about watering a young tree. And even if it's an established tree, this year across the state, it's very, very dry. Now, trees that have been in place more than maybe 5 years or so have a well-established root system. So watering isn't quite as critical, although a good deep soaking, such as letting the hose run at the base of a tree so that you water deeply, that's much better than frequent light sprinklings that tend to waste the water. So oftentimes to tide a tree through dry spells, watering every 2 weeks or so with a good soaking is better than watering more frequently. Now, if it's a younger tree planted maybe within the last year or two, then they don't have the root system to pump water quite so much out of the soil. So they're a little more dependent on us. And so as kind of a rule of thumb, most young trees need at least a 5-gallon bucket of water every time you do water to give it a good deep watering. And how often to water kind of depends on what the weather does. You know, if it's cool and cloudy and things aren't evaporating, then a good soaking every, 1 to 2 weeks, even on a young tree, is fine. Now, a newly planted tree that you just put in, of course, you need to water well right at planting time, and then we need to watch those a little more closely. So a tree that you just planted, maybe you need to water it every, couple of times a week. Many trees are killed, though, by keeping them too wet. So we don't want to keep even new trees totally saturated. Key point there is when we do water, water wisely, water deeply, and to make a good use of the water that we do have available. Let's talk about fruit trees a little. Gosh, don't those plums look good? Last week's garden column I wrote on plums. Plums are kind of an underused fruit in North Dakota. A tree ripened plum is delicious, and there are certain varieties that are best adapted. Locally owned garden centers usually have, 3, 4, 5, or 6 well-adapted varieties with names like Pembina and Pipestone and Toka, Underwood. Wonderful, wonderful plums. Now, you do need 2 different plum varieties, 2 different names in order to get fruit. plum trees don't grow as large as apple trees do, so many yards have space for a plum tree or two. Or now if a neighbor has a plum and you have a plum, as long as they're different plums types, they will cross-pollinate. Also, if a shelter belt has the wild American plums, that is a good pollinator for these larger fruiting type plums.
Hey, Don, we have a
Yes,
question on
certainly.
on a Harrelson apple tree that has never blossomed and it's 10 years old. Is it a dud? Should I get rid of it or wait for another year or two?
Chances are it's not a dud. There isn't really a there's really not a principle in which a fruit tree would be a dud as long as it produces flowers. But chances are this tree is not producing flowers. Now, Harrelson does take 7 to 9 years in order to come into flowering and fruiting. So you could be on the verge of getting fruiting. A couple of things though, so 10 years is getting a little bit on the outside. A couple of things to watch for. Um, does it flower? Now, if it flowered and you got no fruit, then maybe there's not another apple variety close enough to be pollinating. But if it's just all green and you've never had any flowers, one thing to watch for is if you're fertilizing the lawn, oftentimes that lawn fertilizer goes down into the root system and it keeps the tree too green. It keeps it juvenile and young. And so don't fertilize, don't get lawn fertilizer around the apple tree. And now when I say don't get it around the apple tree, this is a great question, by the way. The root system of an apple tree is at least as far out as the tree is tall. For example, if the tree is 15 feet tall, those roots are out at least 15 feet
Oh, wow.
from the trunk.
Okay.
So sometimes it just means maybe the grass isn't going to be quite as lush or underneath that apple tree, but that will help get fruiting. And so do consider that.
Okay, that was for Brad. So hopefully that'll help Brad out with his Harrelson tree.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great. Yeah, but I'm sure hoping it's going to bloom and fruit for you this year. This might be your year. As long as we're talking about apple trees, of course, we all know that apple trees, or we've heard that apple trees should be pruned. But when we're standing at an apple tree, it's not always so evident as to what should we actually be cutting out. Couple of key points here, and one is that apple trees are best pruned in kind of a pyramidal Christmas tree shape so that the widest branches are at the base. And here's the reason for that. The apple tree will flower and fruit better in the areas that are getting more sunlight. And if left to its own devices, an apple tree gets big and round, and the apples are all up on the upper portion where it got good sunshine. That's where the flowers were produced. So if we can kind of taper the tree, then more of the outer area and the lower area will get more sunlight, and then it will produce flowers and fruit lower down. Now, that's easier to do on a younger tree. Just start at the base and work your way up. On an older tree, it may take you 5 years to just over time try to get the top tapered up a little bit. Um, and you can also reduce the height also on an older apple tree. Then in addition to that, especially on an older apple tree, just start going interiorly where you see all the crisscrossing branches and all the thickness. Just start pruning that out. A good visual is that you should be able to throw a football through a well-pruned apple tree and not have it touch branches. What that does is it allows sunlight and air to penetrate the tree, and then you get a better fruit crop rather than all this tangle of little tiny crisscrossing branches. And let's see, it's impossible to prune too much. The apple tree will love it. And so anyway, and the timing of apple tree pruning, now is a good time. Even if it started to leaf out a little bit, the apple trees can still be done. It would be better to prune than not to prune. Well, here's a picture of, remember when I was describing on cutting the kind of these side branches on a tree? Well, here, when we're doing that on on a fruit tree, here's a good diagram showing the proper pruning cuts. If you see way over on the right hand of your screen, the flush cut, that's a bad pruning cut. It's actually cut too flush. The good pruning cuts, the proper pruning cuts, leave that little ring of tissue called the branch collar. Um, that's quite important. Sometimes we think that we should get it as flush as possible, but they did a lot of studies on this and found that those areas close better if we stay just beyond that little ridge or branch collar. But we also do not want to leave a stub, so you don't want to go any farther out than that either. Let's talk about lawn care a little bit. And now, of course, a lawn is kind of meant to be just a canvas on which the rest of your yard is featured, but it's nice to have a good lawn as well. So for raking, in the spring of the year, we want to wait until the lawn has dried up enough so that so that you don't pull it apart when we're raking. And take a look over on the right-hand side, the power raking machine, sometimes called dethatcher. Now that really takes the fluff up and out of a lawn. That, if you do power raking, it's best to delay that until the grass is green and growing. Otherwise, that can be a little hard on a tender lawn too early. How do you know if your lawn should be power raked or dethatched? And if you see the diagram that shows the profile cut through the lawn, uh, the thatch layer is what we look at. And that's the layer of tannish, undecomposed grass between the grass blades and the soil. Now, we do want a certain amount of thatch in the lawn because that helps insulate the lawn. It helps conserve moisture, so moisture doesn't all evaporate out. And it also keeps the grass a little cooler during the heat of the summer. So the right amount of thatch layer is good. And the recommended depth is about a half an inch, about a half an inch of thatch. So if you ever do take a little plug out of your lawn, look at that area. As long as it's not over a half an inch, you're in good shape. Now, many lawns don't need power raking or dethatching ever because that thatch layer can naturally decompose or decay and add nutrients back down in. So it all depends on how much of a buildup that you're getting that builds up before it decomposes. Sometimes you may have also seen the core aerating, where it lifts up the little plugs of soil up out of the lawn. That's especially beneficial if your lawn is hard packed. Core aerating to bring up the little um, kind of pebbles of soil. Now let's look at crabgrass prevention. That's another common question, is when should we be putting on crabgrass preventers in the spring? Of course, the first thing is to make sure that the weedy grass in your lawn is crabgrass. Now, crabgrass is over on the left-hand side of the screen, that kind of yellowish green grass. Crabgrass grows each year from seed that it deposited the previous year. So crabgrass is an annual weed that has to regrow. And so you usually don't see crabgrass until, well, probably sometime in mid-May or late May. Now, on the other hand, we have in the middle photo, quackgrass. Now look at the pearly white rhizomes underneath the soil level there of quackgrass. Sometimes quackgrass gets mistakenly nicknamed crabgrass. Now, quackgrass with the pearly white roots is a perennial. It's a winter hardy perennial, so that lives from year to year to year and continues spreading outward. So that starts appearing in the spring, the same time the rest of your lawn grass starts to green up. So if you're seeing this, a weedy grass in early spring, chances are it's quackgrass and not crabgrass. Or you can dig down and look at the pearly white roots. The reason it's important to distinguish between the two is that A crabgrass preventer won't prevent crackgrass. Crackgrass just grows right through it. So the first thing is to identify for sure if you actually do have crabgrass. Now, crabgrass starts to germinate in our lawns when the soil temperature gets to about 50 to or 55 degrees. So a person can do a little Google search to see what the North Dakota soil temperatures are, and usually you can locate the nearest town to you. I checked Fargo a day or so ago. Our soil in the upper several inches is still in the 30s. So we have a ways to go before crabgrass will start to germinate. If you don't get the crabgrass preventer on early enough, the crabgrass will just grow right through it. It's a preventer. So anyway, timing is key on crabgrass prevention. Now let's talk about fertilizing lawns a little bit. The research in turf growth has caused this to be kind of realigned. The recommendations have changed a little bit on lawn fertilizing. We used to think that lawn fertilizer was best applied in early spring to kind of coax the lawn into greening up early. Now they found that that kind of wasn't the best route, that actually kind of force fed grass before it's ready to grow, and the grass really wasn't able to use the fertilizer yet, and a lot of it would just kind of run off if we got really, really heavy rains. So 2 times of year that they found that lawn grass is best able to utilize fertilizer, and that is closer to Memorial Day. After the grass is actively growing, maybe you've even mowed it a couple of times, and so closer to Memorial Day, the lawn is able to readily use the fertilizer we put on. The second important time of the year is right around Labor Day. And Labor Day in September, if we fertilize then, helps stimulate long, deep roots and provides a healthy lawn. Another thing that's very interesting, if you were to fertilize your lawn only once per year, do you know what the recommended day would be? And that is Labor Day. The fall fertilization has actually been found to be more important than the spring fertilization, but the two of them working together make a good deal. Now, seeding. If you have areas in the lawn that need to be reseeded, some dead spots or even some dog spots, or you're seeding a brand new lawn, the a key factor is to make sure that you choose a grass seed that's well adapted for our region. And most of our lawns are Kentucky bluegrass. So mixes that are high in Kentucky bluegrass, such as half Kentucky bluegrass, that makes a good mix. Oftentimes they have creeping red fescue in. That's a good mix too. Avoid mixes that say they have annual ryegrass in a high proportion. Well, sometimes you'll see a lawn seed package that says it grows rapidly. You'll have a lawn in 2 weeks. But when you look at the ingredients, oftentimes that fast growing grass is annual ryegrass, and it does grow fast, but it doesn't survive winter. So be cautious of mixes that have annual ryegrass that are often very cheap also. And consult with a local garden center too. Sometimes there are mixes for your certain geographic area. There might be mixes of grass seed that they recommend for different areas around the state. Grass seed doesn't sprout either until the soil temperatures get 50 to 55 degrees. So there's no point in seeding too early in spring. Otherwise, the sparrows just peck away at it. But instead, wait till probably, the first half of May is a good window for seeding lawns. Let's talk about watering on lawns a little bit. And of course, now in much of the state, if we don't get some rain or moisture, we probably should give our lawns some water. Lawns stay dormant. Our adapted grasses do remain dormant when it's dry, and they can go into like summer dormancies, but there is a point of no return. And so generally, especially when temperatures are warm, lawn grass needs something, at least a 1/4 inch of moisture every 5-6 weeks or so in order to maintain a healthy turf. So another key point is to, when you do water, water deeply if possible. Now, when we say deeply, the preferred amount of lawn watering would be 1 inch per week in one application. Now, a rain would be nice, 1 inch rain. If we got that every week, our lawns would be beautiful. So 1 inch once per week, and put on in one application so it soaks down nice and deeply. Or if your soil is light and sandy, then divide it into 2 applications. What that does is it encourages deep roots that will, you see, as a good deep watering that goes down down into the soil, that encourages the roots to also grow deeply. And then during dry periods, those long roots will be able to use some of the moisture down below. A very damaging way to water is to water frequently and shallowly, because that encourages shallow roots. And those are the lawns that are most prone to becoming brown and damaged in the heat of the summer. So key to water deeply, but less often. But again, in parts of the state here, lawns are going to probably have to have a little something. And even if a person can't water deeply, at least even a 1/4 inch applied to keep the grass crowns hydrated. But if you can afford, if you're in a position to do it, then apply at least 1 inch. A straight-sided soup can works great to put under the sprinkling area, because oftentimes it takes longer to apply 1 inch of moisture than we might actually realize. So a little bit of spring in the vegetable garden. My wife and I love vegetable gardening. This is our vegetable garden in South Fargo. And the point I wanted to make was that we can do our vegetable gardening in 2 phases, because some vegetables that are called cool season vegetables, they can be planted in cold soil, and they'll also tolerate a little bit of frost. And in that group are things like lettuce and radishes, onions, peas, kale, potatoes take a fair amount of cool. And so we can be planting many of those things in the end part of April, and they'll do just fine. Now, on the other side of the vegetable spectrum are the ones called warm season vegetables. And those are vegetable types that are injured even if the temperatures get even close to freezing. And they also do not like cold soil. If planted in cold soil, they'll just languish and go downhill. In the warm season category are things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, squash, pumpkin, cucumbers. Those should all be delayed until the soil is nice and warm and danger of frost is less. So usually the last half of May, sometime between the 15th and the 30th of May, is usually better for the warm season type crops. And growing watermelons is one of my favorites, so I couldn't resist putting this in. Now, the season in North Dakota is short for some of these long season type crops like watermelon, but there was research done at NDSU in the 1970s as to how can we get melons, both watermelon and muskmelon, to ripen up faster in North Dakota. Well, a couple of ways we can do that. One, choose a variety that says it's for short seasons, or that ripens up like in 70 or 80 days, instead of a variety that takes like 100 days. Those are very late for our season. So choose a variety that ripens earlier, for one thing, but also the use of clear plastic mulch. Notice here in our vegetable garden, before I planted these melons, I laid down clear plastic mulch. I weighted down the edges. And then when I planted these, I started them also as a little peat pot plant, seeded into peat pots May 1st. And then around May 25th, I set the plants out I planted the plants out into the garden. So to plant the watermelon plants into the plastic, you just cut a little slit and plant it down in, and then fasten the little slit back in place with some soil. What the clear plastic mulch does is it allows the sun's rays to penetrate down through the plastic and creates a greenhouse over the soil, and it really warms up very nicely. And of course, that warm soil is key to making a watermelon or muskmelon think it's down in Texas somewhere. And so a good way to warm up and actually get some really nice sizable melons in North Dakota. And now a person might think, wouldn't black plastic warm up better? And the answer is actually no. If you lay black plastic over the soil surface and put your hand on the top of the black plastic certainly feels warm in sunshine. But if you slide your hand underneath, the soil is still dark and cool underneath. See, the benefit of clear plastic is that it allows the sun to penetrate down through. Now, if you don't have space in your garden for a whole row of watermelons, you can still do this by laying a 4-foot by 4-foot square of plastic, and even one melon plant grown like that will help. So I want to wish everybody a happy spring. I'm going to leave my contact information on for just a couple seconds, then I'll stop sharing the screen. Feel free to contact me at donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu. Even though my primary responsibilities are to Cass County, I'll gladly help anyone, or I'll help also direct you to the county extension office right in your own counties. So I will stop
Wonderful.
sharing that, and let's see if there are any other questions that we have.
We've got some really good ones, Don, and there's a number of them on lawns, and they wanting to deal with the bumpy lawns. They are thinking they're from worms or night crawlers. What do you think, and how can we control this problem?
Yes, if anybody that's walked across a lawn that's affected by night crawlers knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's like walking across a field of golf balls. And yes, if you've noticed the bumpiness, chances are it is from earthworms or night crawlers. And so what do we do about that? Well, actually, night crawlers and earthworms are classified as a protected species because they actually improve the soil as they go through and tunnel and they aerate and all. So they actually are protected. And as a result, there are no chemical products that are legally labeled for nightcrawler or earthworm use. There just are no products. So a couple things we can do. The power raking that we mentioned in the spring of the year, go through and power rake. At least that will help level it off, at least temporarily. Also, when you do water deeply. When you water lawn, water deeply, which helps keep the night crawlers sometimes down more where the moisture is. So let the soil surface dry out more, the lawn surface dry out more, and maybe the night crawlers will stay down. But it is where night crawlers are very where it's problematic. You oftentimes end up needing to power rake each year or every other year. So I wish there were a product, but there isn't.
Okay. And then one question about watering lawns too. Does it matter what time of day you water your lawn? Is there a recommended time?
There is early morning. There's a couple of reasons for that. If we water in the evening, and if the surface of the grass blades stay damp all night, there's more chance of having lawn diseases, fungus type diseases. If we water in early morning, such as again, you might, if you have an automatic sprinkler or something, it's easier. Otherwise, we just have to get out of bed earlier. But 4 or 5 a.m. if a person watered, then the evaporation isn't so great. It'll have time to penetrate down in, and yet the sun will be coming up and it'll dry out the grass blades better.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Good.
so
I'm taking lots of
we
notes here.
might think a person might think, water at night so it doesn't evaporate, but then you can get lawn uh, disease problems.
Okay, let's switch to, we've got some more questions on shrubs. Julie has an older climbing rose that is over an arbor, and it has lots of thick, older growth. What do you recommend for her and pruning? I'm sure she's
Yeah,
going
there are
to.
some wonderful kind of climbing type roses that are quite winter hardy. One is Henry Kelsey, another is William Baffin. Both are Canadian roses. And every so often, every number of years, 3, 4, 5 years, they can be thinned out. The oldest canes on the arbor should be removed and save the younger, more juvenile, more vigorous canes, and get rid of the oldest woody ones that probably aren't bearing as much.
Okay. And then on that same note, Karen has a question about a lilac bush that gets a lot of sprouts. And is your information on pruning about the same for a lilac bush? And I've got a lilac bush right. I can't point to it right now. I'm having a hard time, but that one in the corner there is needing some pruning too. And I'm interested in this as well.
Sure. Well, a couple of things to do with lilacs. Sometimes they just need a little bit of height maintenance, and that can wait until after they're done flowering so that you can enjoy this year's flowering. Then right after flowering, do a little bit of shaping, etc., and then you don't lose a year of blossom. If it looks like it needs rejuvenation, such as if the bottom is all bare, then it's better to early in the season here, cut it all the way back and let it regrow.
Okay. And a couple more fertilizing questions. People have really great questions. When is the best time to fertilize shrubs and perennials?
Shrubs and perennials in early May. A person could put it down in late April, but have it in place at least by early May so that as the shrubs or perennial flowers are starting to grow, then they'll have that extra nutrition. In the case of perennial flowers, then they'll have that nutrition to produce more flowers. In addition to putting the fertilizer down, if you use a granular type, it's important to water that so it's activated. Or even incorporate it into the soil a little bit,
Okay, good.
incorporate it in a little bit so it gets actually activated. If it sits in dry soil, the plant won't be able to take it up.
And that was another question too about should you dig in your fertilizer and water? So that's
Yeah,
awesome. Got that covered too.
sure,
Perfect.
dig in water.
Okay. Let's see. Let's take one more. We've got just so many great questions, but we're kind of running up against our time. But Cindy has a question. Do spruce trees need fertilizing? And if so, when is a good time to do them?
In May, they can be fertilized in May. And if they don't look like they've put out much growth, look at the ends of the spruce. And if you aren't getting much growth, yes, then a fertilizer, again, 10-10-10 is good. And so fertilize if you feel they haven't put out much growth by examining the outer twigs.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, Don, any last comments or anything else you want to share with our
Well,
audience here
thank you. This
today?
has been so nice to be with you again. It seems like it was just yesterday, even though it was February. And
I know, time
the time
flew.
goes quickly, and feel free to invite me anytime. We can always talk about fall type items too, things to do in the fall of the year.
We would absolutely love to do that. We'll call you back whenever we can, Don. That's awesome. We're eager to get outside and get some fresh air and do some work in our yards. And now we know exactly what to do with our
And
yards
the
instead of getting
the weather sounds like it's going to get a little better now.
Yeah. Well, and that sounds great. And I just want to thank you again for all your help on this and this wonderful program that you put together, especially for our AARP audience. We especially appreciate that too. So thank you all for joining us today for the Passport to Healthy Living. Shape up your yards, shrubs, and trees. Thank you all.
Thank you much.